Good evening. 3 days after the attack on London Bridge, vigils have been held for the victims, 23-year-old Saskia Jones and 25-year-old Jack Merritt. They'd both been helping to run a programme for educating offenders when one of those attending, Usman Khan, attacked people with a knife. Mr. Merritt's father has criticised some of the response to the attack, including political pledges to review the early release of convicted terrorists. He said his son had given his everything to fight against an agenda of hate. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn were among those attending a vigil near London Bridge, as our special correspondent Lucy Manning reports now.
In the city where recently Jack Merritt and Saskia Jones had proudly held their degree certificates, hundreds stood silent. His girlfriend, his mum and dad held on to each other as they were surrounded by support. This was what Cambridge had meant to them. And this is what they meant to their friends and families. Jack Merritt's girlfriend Leanne leaving flowers. In the City of London, minutes from where they died, the noise of political arguments quietened.
We come together this morning in condolences, but also in a spirit of defiance, to say that London will never be cowed or intimidated by terrorism.
Bryonn Bain was speaking at the prison education event on Friday. He'd spent the day before with Jack Merritt at a high-security jail.
He was inspiring. He had a bright light, right, in his eyes, and he was a young kid, but he, was a Cambridge grad, so it could have been anywhere, done anything, with his elite education, his privileged education.
He ran down when he heard shouting in the building.
It felt like a war zone, it felt like total chaos, but, these guys stepped up in the moment and, did what, few would do and put their own lives in harm's way.
Professor Bain says Jack was the first to confront the attacker.
He was brave in his own regard. He was the first line of defense. He was the first person to confront him at the door. I saw people die. I saw things that I'm never going to be able to unsee.
The first eyewitness from inside the building, he praised those former prisoners attending the event who fought back.
Many of the folks in that space, would not be here today, right, if it weren't for these guys who did time in prison and literally saved lives.
And instead of running away, more details about the bravery of the event staff who ran after the attacker, including a maintenance man called Andy.
When the knife goes to his chest and, kill or open the door is the choice. He pauses for a moment. He's reluctant to spill all this out onto the pavement when members of the public are going to be facing the same problems, but he makes exactly the right choice. The door's opened, out the terrorist falls.
Like Jack Merritt, Saskia Jones was trying to play her part in improving people's lives.
She was a lovely, lovely woman. She made me laugh. She called me on things. Lots of people are quite scared of me. She wasn't. She was fearless. She was a warrior. She was going to change the world. Maybe she will.
But their mourning is done at an intensely political time. The politicians have come to pay their respects, but Jack Merritt's father has been clear. He doesn't want his son's death to be politicised. He doesn't want this to mean politicians bringing in tougher sentencing. Tonight, Jack Merritt's father wrote his son would, if he could comment on his death, be seething that it was being used to perpetuate an agenda of hate. Feel his passion, he said. Never give up his fight. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
Well, BBC News has learned that the attacker had been under investigation by the security service MI5 since his release from prison last year, but he'd been given one of the lowest priorities. He'd been convicted of a terrorism offence in 2012. As part of his release conditions, he was obliged to take part in the government's desistance and disengagement programme, which aims to rehabilitate those involved in terrorism. Questions are now being asked about the role of prison and the probation services and how effective de-radicalisation programmes can be, as our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sandford explains.
And she says, my mujahideen brothers in the cause of Allah.
Usman Khan, radicalised as a teenager by the notorious extremist Anjem Choudhury before being convicted of plotting terrorism. He spent 8 years in prison and another year being closely supervised by police and probation. But despite all those years and still being under supervision, he came to London on Friday and killed 2 young people. How did the system fail? Former Governor Ian Acheson wrote a report for the government on how to deal with terrorism prisoners, which he feels wasn't properly implemented. He says the number of these prisoners is relatively small.
There's only 221 of them. We have to get in there and start challenging and measuring if or how they can change. If they refuse to change, or if they are demonstrating that they're pulling the wool over authorities' eyes by pretending they're changed, they're still dangerous, and in my view they should be kept in prison indefinitely.
After being convicted in 2012, Khan did several counter-terrorism courses while in prison, though some people question their effectiveness. On release last year, he had to do further de-radicalisation, what's called the Desistance and Disengagement programme. He wore a GPS tag and had severe restrictions on where he could go and who he could see. And although his behaviour seemed good, he was also still an active person of interest for MI5. Victims campaigner Harry Fletcher has been told that Khan was given permission to travel once before in the summer, but last time he'd been accompanied by a police escort.
Then he was invited by the Institute to be a student at the course held last Friday. He applied for permission to go and it was granted, but this time he travelled alone without an escort.
So Usman Khan was viewed as safe enough to come here to the event at Fishmongers Hall. But he wasn't safe at all. He'd duped everyone and he came on a mission to kill. The father of Jack Merritt, one of those Khan murdered, has said he would be livid at his death being used to call for tougher sentences. But the Prime Minister, who's done just that, immediately defended himself.
I've campaigned against early release and against short sentences for many years. It was in my manifesto in 2012 when I was Mayor of London. I said it in August, and it's in the Queen's speech.
We have to understand that no government can prevent every attack. No one would believe any political leader who said they could.
The inquiries into how Khan's murderous intent was missed are already underway, and a check on 74 terrorism prisoners recently released has resulted in 2 of them being returned to prison. Daniel Sandford, BBC News, London Bridge.
With me in the studio, our home editor, Mark Easton. If someone asked you the direct question, Mark, what went wrong here, what would the answer be?
Well, I think it's become very clear that major errors of judgment were made by those who had responsibility for ensuring that the public were properly protected from Khan, a man considered so dangerous that actually he was on the highest level of public protection controls, but as we've heard, was allowed to travel to London alone. Now, public protection arrangements are led by multi-agency boards involving the police, the prison service, the probation service, and there's actually been a 70% increase in the numbers managed under that system since 2010. But when it comes to police, for instance, a committee of MPs recently warned budget cuts would lead to dire consequences for public safety. Another parliamentary committee warned the prison service is in the depths of an enduring crisis. And a parliamentary report said years of underfunding and botched reforms had left probation in a mess. Did those pressures make it more likely that poor decisions would be made? Now, politicians from across the spectrum are already promising that they would increase money for the police and other justice measures if elected. But now, the whole approach to managing the risk of this very dangerous group of radicalised individuals is, as we've heard, under review, and one must assume, I think, that there will be new protocols and new safeguards introduced.
OK, Mark, thanks very much again. Mark Easton there, our home editor.